So I was first transferred to Morgan when I was a fairly new job coach. And after meeting him and kind of talking to the last job coach about the kind of supports he needed, I realized I had no idea what I was doing and where to start with him. And it became really apparent when we volunteered together at the Boys and Girls Club, which was basically just wiping tables, and then we'd leave. But I ended up doing the majority of the work, with Morgan kind of wandering off and kind of doing his own thing. I couldn't keep him on task, and he definitely did not care or want to work. So that's when we kind of pulled you in for help.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to experience success when somebody is at a point where they feel stuck or at a wall. Coming in, if I'm working with a job coach, it's great if we can identify a small area of success that we can work towards, really break those goals down. So we were looking at washing the table, right? And that's, I mean, it's a seemingly easy job, but it's actually can be pretty complicated for somebody who hasn't really had the expectation of cleaning a table before.
Right.
So we broke down, I think, a task analysis. We used task analysis to look at the different steps. And there was a couple things that you were doing that wasn't prompted, there wasn't any sort of cue, so we were able to identify the different steps and put it into a visual support that we could sequence one by one by one and move to your prompting. You're doing a lot of correction, a lot of error correction, moving it to anticipating when he would need some support and using that visual prompt and that visual support to help him do what he was supposed to do. Yeah. And when did Dad start sending the money?
Well, he actually, I was going to say, when you came in too, you kind of had him start doing that, I think. I think that was after you, to make it worth working, because it was a volunteer site. So really there was no reason for Morgan to want to clean or feel he needed to. But at that point, we talked to his father, and he agreed to send quarters with him, so that we could take him to the mall afterwards, after he completed his shift.
Oh, yeah, the gumballs, yeah.
Yeah, go for a little walk and get gumballs.
I remember he'd have a cap with him, and he would just fill that cap with all of the gumballs.
And then they'd all go in his mouth.
Cool.
Okay. Morgan, thank you so much for coming to the Black Council. You already got a quarter. That's awesome. Hey, we are gonna wash tables today. These are our materials. Can you wait? This is paper towels. This is water. This is soap. This is sanitizer. I'm going to show you a new way to wash tables, okay? I'm going to pick this up. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to do it. I'm going to rip. You try it. Pick it up. Pick it up. Can I help you? Can I help you? Pick it up. Wrap this around 3 times. 1, 2, 3, and rip. Awesome, dude. That was so great. There's another quarter. I'm gonna do it first, okay? Up, over, and down. You try it. Can I help you? I don't know. Can I help you? Yes. Up. Over. Down. Look how the lines are right next to each other. I'm gonna wash the whole table. You do it. Up. Nice. Keep on going. That was perfect. Another quarter. Morgan, you're a rich man.
Okay, we're going to work for quarters. Let's clean that table, Morgan. Let's restart. Morgan?
Direct him to the paper towels. That's the step he's on.
not wiping the table. So when we first decided to bring in visual supports for Morgan, we started with single pictures, and then we kind of built up to sequencing those pictures. And it was at that point that we decided we want to bring in some sort of electronic. One, because it looks typical, everyone carries around their laptop or phone. So we talked about it and we decided on the iPad so that we could transfer the pictures onto those, and in the future he would also be able to use it as a communication device. There was already a timer built into it, and we actually were able to use the organization that I work for, Trillium, had invested in staff iPads to use to try out with clients before actually having their families or other funders purchase that for them. So it was a perfect fit. We started using that with him, and it went really well. And suddenly I was kind of taken out of the picture, and he was able to rely on his iPad and to keep him on task during that volunteer position. It was at that point that I actually felt really confident and thought Morgan was ready for a job, and I was ready to start looking for a job for Morgan.
Okay, so Maggie, I was really surprised when you came to me and said that you had found a job for him, because when we first started working together, you were talking about how this was kind of like pulling me in was the last option before asking for someone else to start working with him.
Yes.
And so, once you saw that he could work and you can give him tasks, you just went for it. And I would have assumed it would have taken maybe 3 months to find a job. I think you had that job lined up within like a week or two of deciding that it was time to look for a job. So we didn't have a lot of time to prep him. One of the things we did is we used this social story, and it's more of a social narrative, because interviews are really tough for anybody, whether you have a disability or not. And oftentimes interviews have nothing to do with actual job, especially if you're going to be talking about the interview. Or talking during the interview as opposed to working. We had set up a working interview, and so this social narrative, we just got pictures of him, and it talked about how he is going to have an interview, what he's going to do, that you're going to go pick him up that day, that he was going to meet his boss, shake her hand, and we showed it to him at his house when we picked him up. We showed it to him in the car once we got to the place. And then we showed it to him again right before we walked in.
Yeah.
And I don't think he loved watching it. He was kind of like, looked a little bit irritated, but at the same time, for a guy who traditionally doesn't do that well in new places, he rocked it and got the job.
He followed it to a T, I think.
Yeah.
Of what we had laid out for him.
And then what about the rules? Where did the rules fit?
We had noticed that there were a few major issues that he would run into. So we decided to make a list of things that were appropriate for work and were not appropriate at work. But the way we phrased them all were kind of in a positive light, that he didn't feel like we were kind of coming down on him, like, you cannot do this. Instead, for example, it would say, I cannot even remember one, two.
Well, instead of saying no, you can't do this, it was like, yes, you can. Instead of saying no, it was like when, right? So,
yes, yeah.
So it's not that you can't do these things; it's that you can do it after work, or you're going to work hard and you're going to get a pizza. It was stuff around that. There were some things like, no, you can't pick your nose, which was a problem, but it was framed positively as much as possible.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do an assessment too, so we assessed his box folding skills, and he did really, really well. At your office.
Like we didn't even know he could do it before.
Yeah, and we ended up taking a video, and I think that video was more for us than it was for him, because I wanted to have that video just in case things did kind of blow up at the working interview, that at least we could show the manager, say like, hey, like, we know he can do it, like, we're not just messing with you here. But I feel like having that video in my back pocket brought my anxiety level down more than it helped anybody else in the situation.
Right, it did nothing for Morgan.
Yeah.
It was more about us. So before the actual interview, we talked to Morgan's family, because he appeared to be a little rough around the edges, and actually had my husband trim his beard and his hair for the interview, which was great. That is, family supported him in doing that and kind of put aside the money. to make that happen, we also decided that it was important for Morgan to have everything set up the day of, and so we created the social story that Sean spoke about, and shared that with Morgan multiple times on the way to the restaurant. And Jess was actually already at the restaurant because we wanted the coworkers and supplies all set up for him when we walked in.
So I had gotten there a little bit earlier, and the door was locked, and they had the music on really loud, so I was banging on the door and let Maggie know that it was going to be a little bit later, so they did a loop around the block a couple times. And when I got in, I was able to share the social story with them, so they were prepared and knew what Morgan had been prepared with. And then I set up his workstation, so the boxes were there, ready for him to fold, and there wasn't anything else in the way, so he could just rock right in and get started.
I think that was important, so it didn't seem rude that he walked in, shook their hand, got right to work, bought a pizza, and then left again. So that's why we kind of thought that was the best approach.
And the manager there, who was there for the interview, was really thankful and said, "Wow, I'm glad to know this in advance. Thank you for coming in." So that was helpful too. So one last thing that I wanted to share was that I had been at the transition program where Morgan attended when he was in high school, and I was walking out the door and I shared where I was going, that I was going to go support Morgan at his interview, and some of the staff there was disbelieving that Morgan had an interview, and they remembered the high school Morgan, and they had not seen all of the changes that he had made and that Maggie and Sean had supported him in, and so they didn't quite believe that it was going to be a successful interview. So it was really exciting to be able to share all that we had prepared so that it would be a success for Morgan.
He got the job, and we were all really excited. And what occurred to us is that when we were doing the job at the Boys and Girls Club, he never really worked longer than 10 minutes because there just wasn't enough for him to do. So we usually, worked for 10 minutes. And I think before we started working together, that 10 minutes of work was probably a lot longer because you were trying to, yeah. So we initially started with just 10-minute segments, and then we went for a walk around the block. Because, this guy has never worked before. He hasn't really had demands on him around work, so we didn't really want to push it too far.
And that's something we actually set up with the manager. So he was paid for only an hour of work, but we were probably there like an hour and a half.
Yeah, because we were taking all these mini breaks in between. And then you were training him on how to actually do the job. Yeah, and that kind of started over at where we were at the Boys and Girls Club with Hand to Hand initially, because it was a new environment, new expectations, new rules to follow. We kind of went back to the hand over hand, this time with the pictures on the iPad. But he caught on quickly because he knew he could do it and had been successful before. So we were able to increase those shifts to 15 minutes. Yeah. And take, I think then, just 3 breaks. Yeah. 3 breaks for a shift. And the iPad was handy because it had that timer in it. So it was, the timer would go off, and that was his cue that it was time to go on that walk. And he could set it himself. So what I remember is that I was actually, I couldn't come in for like 3 or 4 weeks, and we were having a conversation on the iPad, and you were still having to manipulate it. And I was having you do hand over hand with him to use the iPad, and we had this conversation. And I remember saying to you, like, can you please just do the hand over hand? I think you were a little skeptical if he would actually end up using the iPad. But you promised me that you would continue to do the hand over hand for that 3 weeks, and I think there was just this day that you looked up and he was using it. It went from like not being able to use it, but you never did it for him. You made him do it with your support, and then one day he just started using it. So I think that's pretty cool. It was shortly after that when we were able to bump up the length of working again. Right, to 30-minute shifts. Yeah. I mean, for the record now, he works, what, an hour, 2 hours?
Hour and a half, 4 days a week. Hour and a half,
4 days a week. So at that point, we knew that the technology was working, and you and I just happened to go to one of the WISE-sponsored AT-IT conferences, and I got connected there with a DVR counselor who, my coworker Marcia just explained to me that she gets it. This is
Yeah.
a DVR counselor who gets it. It was out of his district. I think, was she in Pierce County?
She was, yeah. He was in King.
And we explained the situation, and she took his case and got us funding immediately to get the technology support in place. So it wasn't Trillium's iPad; it was his iPad that got set up. So.
And I think it was at that point that we decided to also try an iPod with him, because that was going to be a cheaper accommodation than an iPad.
Smaller too.
And smaller too.
Yeah.
So we did try that for a while. So we were able to actually write up a report to give to DVR to say, this is why the iPad is better, this is why he needs it.
Cool.
So it came through relatively quickly. So Morgan at this point still was a one-on-one. So I had to be there with him the whole shift, every single shift, or he could not work. So I brought in Jen, who was new to Trillium, but not new to the field, to kind of shadow me and get to know Morgan and get to know the system we had set up. And I was her mentor, assigned as her mentor, so it was a really easy thing to do. And the way we kind of initially thought was that you'd be my backup, that if I was ever sick or couldn't make it, you'd be able to work with Morgan. But that soon changed, and we decided that we would be doing a transfer. But I think we spent a good month and a half together in there before actually making the transfer complete.
And we slowly, it started with you doing most of the work, and I was kind of shadowing, and then we slowly, incrementally, and, very mindfully put me in your place, and you kind of started backing out.
Right, and
so,
that was physically too.
Right.
It started with you physically far away from him, and then we kind of switched spots eventually. And I think it was a good transition for Morgan too, because he was really familiar with you by the time the transfer did occur. And I was kind of old news because I had just been sitting by the door at that point.
Yeah.
And so I remember around that time, you guys called me with a problem because your executive director had taken a video of him doing his job and showed it to her class, and they had pointed out that he was touching his face and also touching food stuff, and I think it got even worse that he started picking his nose and doing some stuff. And so I came back in and we did this program, again very rule-based because he's a rule-based guy, and I brought in a couple different types of gloves and I let him pick which glove he wanted, and he picked the type of glove that he wanted. There were these latex gloves. I also brought in some gardening gloves in case latex was an issue, and then another type of wintry type of gloves. And I just made a rule that said when the gloves are on, you can't touch your face. But if you want to touch your face, just take the glove off and touch your face and put the glove back on. And whatever I do, I think it's really important to not say no, but to say when. And it's not that he's not allowed to touch his face, it's just that you can't do it when you're working around food. And so the first couple times he was wearing the gloves and he tried to touch his face, I would just kind of block it, have him take his glove off, ask him to touch his face, and then repeat the rule: when the gloves are on, you don't touch your face. If you want to touch your face, take the gloves off. And he got it within the first shift. And I mean, does he do that at all anymore?
He gets to choose when he wants to wear his gloves now. He does have a space where they are always stored, and on days when you can tell he has the need to touch his face or his hair more, he will go and actually just get them himself.
That's
and
really cool.
On other days, he just doesn't wear them, and he'll stay focused on work. And if he does catch himself touching his face, he actually just goes over and washes his hands now.
Awesome. So I think it wasn't working,
Huge.
right? When we first, before you called me in, you were trying to just say don't do it, and it just, there probably are days that sensory-wise it just makes sense that he needs to do those extra things for himself. So Maggie, I gotta say that when it came to fading, it was a huge learning moment for me professionally, that I didn't realize how much my expectations and my experience with Morgan was holding him back. When we first started working together, Morgan had this, his escape behavior was to search out the most nasty chemicals that he could find and chug them until he threw up and someone took him home. And that's what we experienced together, and I was really terrified. that happening, and so we didn't really set it up in a way that was easy to fade. And it wasn't until you brought Jen on, and Jen was kind of like, okay, like, where's the fading plan, that really kicked us into gear around that.
Yeah.
And I think, Jen, you were really key at making sure that actually worked. And I imagine you had to use natural supports, right, to make that happen.
Right. So I took a lot of these tools that you guys had already put in place, and then I cross-trained Morgan's supervisor and the coworkers that he worked with most often. So then it wasn't us providing all of that support that was already in place, but rather Morgan could reference those tools, or his coworkers could reference those tools when they needed to, and it kind of pushed us out and helped Morgan build his own natural supports and relationships within his workplace.
Yeah, because he's a charming guy. Like, he's fun to work with.
He is, and he definitely has, like, his favorite coworkers and the people that he likes to work with, you know, and so finding those people and really having them become part of Morgan's circle.
And how did the rule sheet help with this process at all?
So by the time I'd come in, Morgan and I did use the rules. It's in a similar way that Maggie and he had used them, where we would reference them right before we would go into work, and then when we would get into work, then he knew what was expected. And slowly I just started to realize that he wasn't really following the rules. Not following them, but wasn't interested in hearing them again and again.
Okay.
And so I just put those in his iPad bag so that he could reference them if he needed to, and I also showed his coworkers where that was, so they could then reference that if there was something on the rule sheet that was happening that Morgan was maybe trying, you know, to sneak under the rug or whatever, then they could be like, oh, Morgan, and then it was the same rules from all of us.
Cool. Now, could you tell, so one of the coolest things was the pizza menu that you two set up. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so Maggie had done a really good job when Morgan first started of helping him to order his own pizza, because that was what he got as a reward for working at the end of each of his shifts. And so Maggie had created, it's a laminated piece of paper, and it has all the different kinds of pizza that Morgan can choose from at the end of his shift. I took all of those pictures and I inserted them into his communication device on his iPad, hoping that that would be a way for Morgan to use the communication device in a meaningful way, in a way that we had already set up and was meaningful, but to create that in a more typical way for him. So he was able to, I worked closely with him and his dad first in the home, which I soon realized that Morgan and his dad have their very own form of communication. So the iPad wasn't a good place to start with the communication device. And I thought, well, since the pizza menu has already been so successful at work, why not use that in the iPad? So then that generalizes. So Morgan was then able to, for a couple weeks, I would help Morgan. We would use the regular pizza menu that Maggie had created, and he would show me the pizza that he wanted on that, and then we would take that picture and find it on the iPad, and we would go through that step together of like finding the button that says at work, and then that all of the pizza choices would come up, and then we would find the pizza choice that matched that pizza choice, and we would go find his manager, and he was able to then tell his manager what pizza he would like at the end of his shift.
Great. And I gotta say, there was this, you told me about that, and you told me that he was using his communication app. I think it's Talk Tablet, right? Which is done by a local developer, Gus Communications up in Bellingham. It's a great program. But I'd never had a conversation. I never talked with Morgan. You know, when we first started working, he didn't use words to communicate. Coincidentally, he started to use words, right? Since working and being in the community, he started to use words. But so I went to his work, and I was like, hey buddy, how's it going? What pizza are you having today? And he was in the middle of working, and he stopped working, opened up his communication app on his iPad, typed in, okay, at work, I have pepperoni pizza, yes please, nodded his head, closed it, and went back to work. And I was just like blown away. Like, he had just talked to me, and I had never had that experience with him, and it was just really cool.
Yeah. it has been really cool watching him grow through just that one piece. I feel like maybe him being misunderstood so often, this helps him to be like, this is what I want.
Yeah.
So it's been really cool.
No, Maggie, I remember that when one of the big barriers to fading that we couldn't really work past was the idea of transportation. So how did you guys get, because now you were providing most of the transportation, Dad was providing some of the transportation.
It was like half and half when I transferred to Jen. So Jen was really the one
Okay.
to
Now he takes the bus.
He is taking the bus successfully. So that took a lot of communication with his dad. His dad had some pretty, some concerns about safety and what that would look like for Morgan to ride a bus.
Legitimate concerns.
Absolutely. And so Sean and I met with Jerry several times and talked about what that would look like, how we would support him, how we would support Morgan. We talked about maybe getting some GPS things on the iPad, just so Jerry could have a very concrete way to know that Morgan had gotten to or from work. But what we ultimately did was when Morgan would get to work, I would just send Jerry a text that he had made it, and then when he would leave, I would send him a text that he made it. And after several months of that being successful, then Jerry was okay with just knowing that Morgan was making it to and from work.
Cool. What about him paying?
So after about 5 months,
because those quarters
riding,
mean gumballs,
right?
Yeah.
So
You're welcome.
how do you get him
and
to
Morgan
let go
is
of
a
that?
very savvy guy. He's very smart. So he had created his own savings account, basically, from all this money he was saving from not paying the bus driver. And then I got a call one day from Access saying that if he didn't pay again, then they would have to discontinue him riding the bus because he needs to pay.
Great. You have one more chance.
Right. So I talked to Access about maybe having his dad pay at the beginning and at the end of his shift. Just having his dad pay. They said that they couldn't do that. He needed to physically pay before he got on the bus, or they couldn't give him a ride home. So I thought, well, maybe if we label his iPad bag with a pizza, which would symbolize his pizza money was in one side and the bus, his bus money on the other side, then maybe that could help. During that time, Morgan would take off the labels because he didn't want people to know where he was storing his money and what it was for. So I several times would wait with Morgan for the bus, and what I've realized is if the bus driver holds Morgan's pizza, he's much more willing to give them money to ride the bus. So I put in place, and I had Access write a note in his profile that they actually physically have to take the pizza from Morgan for him to, that's like his cue of, oh, okay, I have to actually pay you. So now he has been successfully paying for, and it was just, he didn't know what to do with his pizza.
Yeah.
So,
awesome.
yeah.
So I think what really stands out for me here is not, I mean, the job, it's a pretty normal job, and I think there'd even be people out there that would criticize us on the type of job that we helped this guy get. But it's his first job, like my first job was scooping hamster poop at a pet store, right? Like we all have our first job. What sticks out for me for this is that nobody thought he could work. That his whole, he was 22 when you started working with him, 23?
23, yeah.
23, 23 years of, I don't think his educators had the belief that he could work. I think that even internally in our own, agencies, we were skeptical. And it's not like we did anything incredibly special. I think we did what works for a lot of support employees, but we did it with more fidelity, and we did it with more precision, and held those expectations for somebody who supposedly couldn't work. And what surprised me in every single one of these barriers that we had to overcome was as soon as Morgan would teach us how to accommodate the barrier, it was so quick. There wasn't resistance.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a really, for me, I've learned a lot from working with this guy and from working with you two in particular. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's funny because now when I walk in, Morgan sees me and he
Get out of here.
go, you know, which is so powerful. That speaks more than words, you know, because that's him being like, just seeing that self-esteem of like where we started. Because I shadowed Maggie and Morgan a couple times at the volunteer position,
right.
and
Yeah.
so
I remember that.
seeing that to where he is now is just like a world.
So what's next for him?
He, him and his dad are applying for Section 8 housing, so he's looking into getting an apartment where he'll be supported but have his own space and his own.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Wow.
Huge.
Cool.
And he started physically saying words. He says hi. He said thank you to his dad the other day, and his dad called me crying. Like, I have never heard him say these words. And it was like in a totally appropriate way, at a totally appropriate time. So it's been really powerful.